thanks to all of you for being so prompt. And we're really looking forward to this, especially since it is becoming to the end of Women's Month. And the book that Shanthini Naidoo has released is a very special one, and it's very significant to Women's Month, and that's everything that we do celebrate during this time. So I'm going to hand over to you, Shanthini. Welcome. I'm so grateful to you for being so enthusiastic to feature and share with us your journey and share with us how you came about writing this book. So welcome to you.
Hi, Shan. Thanks so much for having me. Hi to everyone. And I'm very excited. It's a different kind of discussion that we're having today compared to the others. And I'd love to hear from any of you, if you could just raise your hand if you've read a little bit about the book, or if you've heard about it. Okay, good. And also just to check how many aspiring writers we have today.
I think we have a lot. I think we have one. Chris is one. We have at least 4 or 5.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, thanks so much for that. And I'll just quickly tell you a little bit about my book. I still feel very privileged to be able to hold it, especially during COVID-19, when publishing delays and everything else threatened to stop it. But I'm very glad that we got it out in time for Women's Month. And it's an amazing South African story. I still say it's not my story. I just wrote it. The women in the story were in solitary confinement, hence the name Women in Solitary, during the 1969 trial of the 22. The ladies were struggle stalwarts who we didn't know very well. I think now they, especially after the book has come out, their names have been coming up quite a lot. But they were friends and comrades of Winnie Mandela. And at the time of reporting on her death and her funeral, I was still at the Sunday Times, where I was a writer for many years. And we had basically tried to reimagine her time in solitary confinement, because she has written about it. She had written about it before. So at Pretoria Central Prison, where she was held, I came across this trial, and that there were 7 other women in those solitary cells with her. Theoretically they weren't together, obviously, but the 7 women who basically also brought the trial to a halt, because they refused to testify against each other, despite being tortured into submission. They didn't let up, and were detained under those strange laws that we had in the old days, where they could be held for 90 days without charge. So those 90 days went on and on and on for it was over a year. And they were, in all that time, separated from their families and from each other. They spoke a little bit in the evenings or early hours of the morning, when they weren't being monitored. And the only other people they saw were security, and not even days. They would appear for trial. I think it was 3 times, and that was it. The rest of the time was completely by themselves in these horrible, cold, dark cells. And the women who are still alive, the 4 remaining who are still alive, obviously passed of the money and goodness.
The sound is very.
I managed to find and track down around the country, and
The
been
sound
the
is
last 2
breaking
or
a
3 years
little bit,
spending lots of
Shanthini.
time with them, or as much as I could, to get the story out. Oh, sorry about that. It's
Okay, no, we didn't.
between
We didn't
load
hear a bit of
shedding
it.
and is that any better?
Yes. Now we can hear you again. Yes, I know you were saying you did spend a lot of time with. Well, it is non-fiction, so you had to spend a lot of time with the the people to actually get the
Yes.
book done. I know we
Yes. And
no, carry on.
no, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I just wanted to know, you said you have been a journalist for Sunday Times. How is it that you chose these four particular women? Obviously, there were very many women who went through similar struggles. So how is it that you chose these four specific women to write about?
So it was interesting because of the Winnie Mandela link, that they were in this trial with her, and um, that they were so unknown and so quiet in their existence, even though they had been in exile and moved back to South Africa. We didn't know about them in those years after, after they returned. And the why them specifically is because their stories were just amazing, first of all, and also because their lives, because they had spoken at the funeral and spoke about their experiences in that time linked to her, but also on their own. They each have an individual amazing story to tell, and collected under this trial. That is why I chose them. But it also, they always say the story chooses you. And it's interesting because the ladies were I felt very connected to them. The one, Joyce Sikhakhane-Rankin, is a journalist. She was the only one I had interviewed before, because she'd done some work for the SABC and things. And the other one was Rita Ndzanga, a unionist, and then Nondwe Mankahla, who is in the Eastern Cape. But the other woman in the trial had a name similar to mine, Shanthie Naidoo. And although we're not related at all, or I'd never known her, and we know of her brother, Indres Naidu, who's quite a famous political prisoner as well. But I hadn't heard of her before in detail, and I thought it fascinated me just from the personal connection, and I'd ended up interviewing them for around Winnie Mandela's death, and just thought their story needed to be told. And actually many other stories need to be told. You're right, there are lots of women, and it's for whoever picks up these stories to decide and sort of define who their characters are going to be, because there were hundreds of them, or thousands even at the time.
I'm going to hand over now to the participants to ask their questions that would come to mind when they look at your story and hear about your story. I'm going to go to Lapo first because her story relates very much to what you have been saying. So Lapo, go ahead.
Hi, so I was asking around the research that you had to do to make sure that you get the right facts with regards to the circumstances surrounding where the women were kept and what they had to go through. I'm pretty sure it wasn't just the interviews alone that you would have done. So how long did it take you, that process, and how was that process for you?
Thanks, Labo. It's very interesting because this book actually comes from my a thesis which I was doing at WITS. At the time, it was April 2nd that Winnie Mandela passed away. I had already done a proposal for another project which was on digital media. And when she'd passed away, and I don't know if you remember at the time, but there were lots of really negative media reports about her. And, the stories that were coming out were really as they are when people recall women in history. It was it was being told by men. It was being disregarding her, her struggles, her time in detention, and the time she was, she had multiple detentions. She was banished to Brandfort for 5 years. She went through a lot, and there was it was also a big mental health aspect at the time, that she had post-traumatic stress disorder. So at the time of the funeral, I decided with my supervisor at WITS to do the research on that narrative being so one-sided, and that it wasn't correct, and everything was very told from a male gaze, as it always is, and that that was part of the research, was that how do we tell feminine stories, how do we learn about the women in our history in South Africa, because there isn't a lot of documentation. I had to go, there was no prison records, because again, they weren't on trial. They weren't detained, they were detained, but they weren't charged with anything. So there's no sort of, some of them didn't even have prison numbers. The actual prison itself is not there anymore. And there is, we've got very, very little in terms of historical papers, because it was destroyed by the apartheid government. So I was lucky to have the women and their families, because remember, they're also quite in their latter years now, so they actually couldn't recall everything. So we had to fill in the gaps with other interviews with other historians and things like that. And I mean, the basic rule, if you're writing about anyone in a non-fiction situation, whether it's for news or for a book, is to have at least 2 or 3 sources on information, so that it's correct.
How long was that process?
So the research took about a year, and then the writing was ongoing in that year. And then I took a little break in between the thesis and the writing of the book, because the publisher had approached me after the the research was marked and had appeared in an article form in the Sunday Times. And the writing of the book, I would say I had to double the word count. So I left it alone for a couple of months and started again in January till about, I think my submission date was also early April. So yeah, 3 or 4 months of adding on to the thesis, but the thesis and the research took at least a year. I'm
Thank
sorry,
you.
and I'm seeing some questions from Chris. Thanks,
Chris,
Labo,
yes.
and good luck with yours.
Yes, go ahead,
So Chris
Chris.
asked,
Yeah,
Um,
I've just got a few questions there for you. Sorry.
mm.
So the first one is, did you ever get demotivated during the writing process? Did you ever think, is this book going to sell? Is this the right thing to actually be writing about?
absolutely, especially because the last bit of the book was written in lockdown. So I had no idea whether we would be printing, and then also the economic situation was terrible. It's a hard it's a hard one to do, and it's also, writing takes a lot of time, and it's not a hugely profitable business. It's something I had to take time out from my regular work to do, and from the family time and whatever it was. So it is that part of it can be demotivating, but the story was always really, really uplifting. And as much as it's a detention and prison story, it's still very positive and a story of survival and triumph over the enemy, as they called it in those days. And that was the thing that will push anyone on, is that if you believe in your story, and I obviously have, from a non-fiction point of view, these women's lives to tell. So it was really, I had to get it right, because they're still alive, and their story needed to be told properly. So I had to push on with it. But yes, there are always going to be moments of finding it tough, and also trying to get to that word count and not being long-winded, or trying to fill in space. You want to make the words count.
And thanks for that. The second question I had was, in telling the story, and it's non-fiction, so you're actually telling something that's really happened. Are you trying to raise emotion in the readers in the way that you write, or are you just telling the facts as they are and letting those facts raise the emotions in the reader?
So it was a bit of both. I would say my input would be about 30% of the work, and the rest of it comes from the women themselves, the quotes that they shared, and also the stories. The stories are very emotional. They were, held in detention. They were away from their families. They were tortured. All of that is very, very emotional. And the only framing I did in terms of why this story now and why is the story important was in a couple of the chapters where I had to say, this is why South Africans need to hear the story in 2020 and why we've got to remember those who came before us. So it was just a reminder that we do have a psychological sort of challenge in South Africa and why that was important. So so yes, you've got to do that a little bit without, you know, leading the or asking the reader to you know, I don't know how to describe it, but to say you have to feel this emotion, but it's more, you know,
You're
this
letting the
is
facts.
why it's important.
Yeah, you're
Yes.
letting the facts
And framing it. Yeah.
on them. I get you.
Yes, framing it.
No,
That's
thank you for
exactly
that.
it. It's a pleasure.
I know you did say that you first wrote an article for the Sunday Times and the publisher approached you. So, you know, can you tell us a bit about the process of how the publisher approached you and how you actually came to decide that you're going to write it as a book?
Yeah, this is the interesting thing about selling books in the country as well. I think it's first of all, I knew when I was writing the story that there was a lot more to tell. I didn't realize that it would become a book. The publisher obviously saw that for themselves. So if we had to think about approaching it from the other way around, you know, publishers normally now ask for 3 chapters or you know, outline of chapters and summary. And I think the most important thing with that is to just you know, make sure the content is relevant, because there's a lot of content out there at the moment. There's tons of it. You know, it's becoming almost too much. People are switching off from content these days. But if your story is strong enough, and it will emerge in the work. And I think that's what the publishers are looking for, because there's also at the same time there is a demand for books at the moment.
Okay, thank you for that. And is there anyone
I have
else
a
who has a
question.
question? Go ahead, Clint.
It's Clint here. I have a question. Yeah. Right. Maybe an odd question to ask, but which I think can be quite helpful for us to hear. In the writing process and of getting published, what are one or two of the criticisms in terms of your writing that you had to kind of grapple with or grow through or improve, that kind of thing?
Sure. You know, and I think that's this week I had someone who actually reviewed the book to say to me that it was nicely done. And she said it was beautifully written, because it's a hard story. It's a really, really difficult story to read, and you've got to write it in an engaging way, you know, and try and take the reader there. So it, for me, you know, and you, I think we're always critical of ourselves. I think I would have liked one more edit. I had 3, but I still would have liked one more, just to make sure that it was, you know, that they were, that everything that I wanted to be there was in there. And luckily, they, you know, the good thing about having a strong publisher is that you get really experienced editors who will tell you. And they were parts of the conclusion which I'd written too long. It was, I ended it off almost with a, there was a, and I know I was trying to add on words, because you don't want to be too short on your words as well. I mean, a book is 70,000 words for you know, not even the biggest book. So I added on a poem at the end, which, and I'm not a poet, which was maybe not the best thing to do. And Alison, the editor, said, you don't need this. This is where you stop. It was 2 paragraphs up, you stop there. So I think overwriting, you know, and also being too flowery, because that is something, I'm a feature writer by profession, so it, you want to do that. And so there were a lot of times I had to pull back and say, this is the quote, this is what we need to say about this particular incident, and leave it at that, you know, instead of sort of buffering everything with flowery language. So yes, it was a story that had enough in it to tell itself. So I had to keep it quite simple, I think.
Okay, thanks. And so I'm just going to hand over to Amanda to ask her questions. So go ahead, Amanda.
Thank you, Shanthie. Thank you, Lee, and everyone for the offering of the reading. We know of Winnie Mandela's 491 inhumane days of solitary confinement and absolute barbaric torture. How did writing the horrific stories affect you personally? And also another question is, do we know why the old synagogue was used for the trials as, I think, an official law office?
Thank you so much, Amanda. You know, when you do a story like this, it changes you forever, because the one thing I've always said is that I was a features writer, I was a news journalist, I did a little bit of social justice work before I left, but my main focuses were, you know, on health and wellness, and I did lots of travel. So this was very different in terms of the subjects that I'd written about before. So it was also a learning for me, because even as a journalist, and I think as South Africans of this generation, we not many of us know about it. I'm very also impressed that you know about that, the old synagogue, because I know people who live around the corner from it and they have no idea what it was used for. They don't know you know, what the purpose of it was. So yeah, it does absolutely change you. The stories also, I now work in corporate South Africa, and you know, we have lots of other issues that we're struggling with, even though we don't have apartheid. You know, we've got corruption, we've got gender-based violence, then in the boardroom we've got politics and you know, the patriarchy and lots of things that are going on around the world and in South Africa. So stories like this, I think, as much as they're horrific, at the end of the day, and spending all this time with these ladies who spent their entire lives doing this, you know, it wasn't for me, it was a maybe 2.5, 3 year process, but they dedicated their lives to it, and they still do. They still feel it's not done in terms of the work. So it taught me also to be patient, that we are sometimes as South Africans not as patient as we can be, that it's still, as much as it's 20 odd years, it's still a young democracy, and that there was lots and lots before, which we don't acknowledge. And also just like determination and grit and resilience, just how strong people are, how strong women are, that I will forever take with me. And it actually, you know, when you now come across something in your own circumstance, and that's what I hope people who read the book will take from it as well, is that you don't have to you know, you can be defiant against things that are not right. It's, I think we've come to a point where we're so nervous amongst each other as South Africans that we don't say when something's wrong. And I feel like this was the whole purpose of these women, and that's what I want the book to give people, is that the strength to stand up to things that are not right, even if it's not, you know, an unjust government that happened in those days, but for now to also, even as citizens, to come together. So yeah, you know, you definitely change, and I think that's also the mark of a good story, is that it will, in its telling, change you as a person. And as for the old synagogue, you asked why it was used in the trials. I don't have um, the reason for that. I actually can look it up, but um, the one thing I do know is that from Pretoria Central, where many of the political prisoners were held for long periods, it's about 2 kilometers away. So that might have been the reason. Also, remember, this was also the scene for the treason trial, so it would have been a distance thing, in terms of getting the prisoners to to the synagogue. But yeah, I mean, your guess is as good as mine as why they chose that particular beautiful venue, which they boarded up and turned into a very sort of awful space, instead of the religious monument that it is.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Amanda. I just want to ask Shanthini, you from a writing perspective, you've mentioned word count several times. Did your publishers give you a specific word count that you needed to meet?
Yes, absolutely. Because of printing requirements, technical requirements, for a book of this physical size, it's that wide. It has to feel substantial. So, and the minimum for that was 60 to 70,000 words, and you can go over, but in terms of engaging a reader, it's a good size, for a book now. There are obviously others that are hugely longer and much longer, and others that are much smaller these days. I've seen the Sonke Msimang's book about Winnie Mandela was about 20,000 words, but then the reader feels almost as if there's more to tell, or this should be an addition to a book. So I think a nice medium is the 70,000 words.
Okay. And your exact word count, just out of interest?
I actually can't tell you that, because I was just thinking that apart from my 70,000, there's still the index and the glossary, and because it's a research-based nonfiction, so yeah, it probably went over another, I would say, another 5,000 words or so with all the additions.
Okay.
So yeah.
Okay, that's very interesting. I'm just going to give the others who haven't had a chance to talk a chance. Is there someone wants to talk? I think it's Ziziwe.
Good. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Shan. Thank you, Chantel. Is that so? Is that correct? Okay.
Shanthini. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you so much. Now, Chantel, I just want to say, you did a great deal. Generations to come, even us, we really need to know more about those struggle icons that worked so hard to get us where we are. Now, my question is, when you were writing this nonfiction book, did you get to the point where she was accused of those disturbing accusations that she was involved in a murder of a teenage child? If so, if not, did you ever get an opportunity to do a research or investigate if those accusations were real or not?
Okay, that's very interesting. It's one of the reasons for the book coming about as well, is that we were trying to separate the fact from the fiction, and to also tell all sides of the story and let a reader work out their own conclusions. I mean, I touch on it a little bit, but there's a very interesting article, if you ever get a chance to look it up, is from Professor Malekapuru Magoba. He's now he was a health ombudsman. Now he's, I think, chairing the ESCOM board, but he's a medical doctor, and he wrote an article after hearing the testimony in that particular trial that you're mentioning, and how the medical evidence was not there. I don't have a conclusion. I can't say yes or no, and did it happen or not, but I definitely think that there are parts of the story that are missing. There's always, and we were not there to tell. And even when Winnie Mandela had passed away, she did the documentary with the French company, who told that story about how the Stratcom, the apartheid government had done this even after Nelson Mandela was freed and things like that. So, where they had planted stories. So without making any conclusions about that, I think we must it's really important, and I'm glad you asked, that we interrogate what is true and what is not true, and why those stories may or may not have been made up. And also, you know, there was a lot of complicated parts of the struggle. Part of the reason for the treason trial was that they were talking about taking up arms, and although they hadn't, you know, it was definitely part of the strategy. But this was now, and there was fallout. There was lots of fallout. You know, one of the stories in the book as well that I wrote about is Solomon Mahlangu, the young freedom fighter who was hanged for his participation in a, you know, very minor participation in the struggle as well. But there was so much that went on in those many years, and I think there's lots of stories that can be told about that as well. There are people who were spies who were around Winnie Mandela. There were people who were her friends. In fact, one of them was part of the reason she was arrested in this trial that I've written about. So it's a very, you know, interesting and mysterious time that those periods of struggle, and because they were not documented very well, we actually don't know what the truth is at the end of the day, and you know who the casualties were. And there are lots more. We're still looking at repatriating bones of struggle stalwarts from other countries and things like that. So yeah, it's a long and winding tale, that one.
Okay,
Thank you
thank,
very much.
thank you,
That's
Siziwe. From Maggie, Zubaida, Julie, is there anyone else who would like to ask a question? Karine? Sadia? I've just got one more question myself. You know, as you said at the beginning, you know, there's many stories of women who have been through such struggles that are not known. Do you see yourself writing another book similar to this? And if not another book similar to this, I know you have been a journalist, would you ever see yourself writing fiction, or do you think they are two completely different types of writing that you can't really cross? What is your opinion of that?
Sure. I've never tried fiction writing, but the one thing that I've realized after the story emerged is exactly, and it speaks a little bit to the question that Siziwe asked just now about, you know, what happened. And I think lots of people have written fiction about that time of our history, and it's also to fill in gaps that you can't. Of information that you can't fill in, because either the people are not alive, or you have you know, only some of the information. And you know, one of them is Jacob Dlamini, a beautiful book called Askari, about you know, a spy situation. And I definitely think there's room for female fiction of that sort. And I think even if somebody had to take this book and you know, fill in some of the gaps, because obviously, you know, I've written 50 years of history in these pages, so there's not, everything is not in there. And yeah, I think it's definitely something to do. And the other thing is that I have been asked already to try and get the work into a video form so that it appeals to younger people, and to tell more stories. And it's very interesting because there are people who are doing it in some ways on social media. Like there's on Twitter, there's South African stories that are coming out. So there's definitely no shortage of material in terms of writing. So I am still, let me finish with this one, and all the, you know, trying to get it out, especially during a pandemic. And it's definitely something I think about in the future.
Okay, that's great to hear. Just as we're rounding off, we're nearing the end of our meeting. I'm going to ask a last time, is there anyone else who'd like to say anything, even just to, if not a question, Perrine, Maggie, Julie.
I just wanted to say thanks very much for your time. It's been very interesting hearing from you. Looking forward to the next bit of work.
Thank you, Chris. I appreciate it. And I'll be very, very keen. You know, I've had quite a few men feedback and, you know, had good responses. So I'd love to hear from you as well. If you eventually get a copy, or even, you know, the extracts in some of the newspapers and things online, free to read. So, you know, to hear what any one of you would like to say about it.
I'll definitely look it up, give you some feedback.
Thanks.
Okay, so I'm just going to hand over to Clint to close the meeting. So over to Clint.
Thank you very much, Shanti, for being with us, the Dolphin Coast Writers Circle today. I was really intrigued by everything you were sharing. And also just to commend everyone who asked questions or made comments. You know, it really enhanced the discussion so much and brought out things that maybe you as an author would not typically have, or not necessarily have shared tonight if it weren't for those individual questions. So well done to everyone. And yeah, congratulations on this book. I'm definitely going to look for the book. And you know, one of the things I also think we must explore is also audiobooks, you know, which is quite popular internationally, especially in the US and the European context, whatever. And there's just like such a big gap in terms of African books, you know, that we can put on audio. And there's so many reasons, good reasons for doing that. In addition to having the print copy and the Kindle copy and all of that. But really well done. And I think we must really say thank you to Shan Lee for this space and for inviting you here tonight. If it wasn't for Shan Lee, we wouldn't have enjoyed this luxury. And as a result of this, I think some of us are going to go out and get your book as well. And I think there are stories that need to be told that have not been told. And I think this is an apt case in point. So thank you so much for your time, and thank you, Shan Lee, for organizing this, and everyone for joining us. And yeah, have a wonderful evening. It's been an absolute pleasure and time well spent being part of this meetup tonight.